Have you ever just sat back after the credits finally roll on a game and thought to yourself, wow, that was genuinely perfect? It is a heavy word to throw around, I know, but we all recognize that exact feeling when it hits. It makes you sit there and wonder what actually caused that reaction. Was it the writing pulling you in so deep that you entirely forgot you had a real life to get back to? Or maybe it was the moment-to-moment gameplay, where the controller just sort of melted away in your hands and every single input felt completely second nature. I think about this all the time. Sometimes a game clicks purely because the world design is just incredibly immersive. You stop running from point A to point B like a robot, and you actually start paying attention to the physics. You notice the way dynamic lighting bounces off a muddy dirt road, or how an enemy AI actually flanks you when you break their line of sight instead of just standing there confused. It is all about those micro details. The heavy, realistic weight of the player animations, the crunch of the audio design, or even just the simple fact that the developers bothered to optimize the game properly so you get a buttery, smooth, stutter-free experience while you're taking it all in. That kind of stuff matters so much. It builds this invisible magic that ties everything together and keeps you completely glued to the screen for hours on end. Whatever that specific secret sauce is, whether it's an unbelievable protagonist, ridiculously satisfying combat mechanics, or just an atmosphere you want to live in, certain titles just nail it. They leave a permanent mark on your brain. So today, we're going to talk about a few of those exact experiences. These are the games that completely pulled us into their worlds and absolutely refused to let go. When you talk about games that completely took over the internet the second they were revealed, Black Myth Wukong is right at the top of that list. And honestly, it entirely deserves the massive amount of hype it generated. We have seen adaptations of the classic Journey to the West novel and Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, countless times across different media, but none of them have ever looked or felt anything quite like this. Game Science really went all in, creating an experience that feels incredibly heavy and grounded. Visually, the game is an absolute powerhouse. Running on Unreal Engine 5, the environmental density is almost overwhelming. You are walking through these incredibly lush, decaying forests, snow-covered mountains, and ancient temples, and the dynamic lighting filtering through the trees just roots you right in the world. And the boss designs are on a whole other level. The Yagwai you fight are deeply tied to Chinese mythology, brought to life with this terrifying, hyper-detailed realism. You can actually see the individual strands of fur on enemies reacting to the wind in your attacks. But obviously, graphics alone cannot carry an action RPG. The combat has to feel perfect, and this is where Wukong truly sinks its hooks into you. The animations are unbelievably fluid. Every single swing of Wukong's staff has this immense weight to it, utilizing that perfect little bit of hit stop when you connect with an enemy so you really feel the bone-crushing impact. It is a brilliant mix of aggressive character action and careful Souls-like spacing. You are constantly switching between different staff stances on the fly. You might use the pillar stance to literally perch on top of your extending staff to avoid sweeping ground attacks, and then immediately switch to the smash stance to close the gap and deliver a massive overhead strike. It demands your full attention, especially because you are heavily relying on dodging rather than blocking. That perfect dodge window is so incredibly crisp. When you nail it and leave behind a little after image of yourself, it feels incredibly rewarding. And when you're playing a game that demands this level of twitch reflex precision, performance is absolutely everything. You need that perfectly smooth, stutter-free frame pacing, because dropping frames right when a massive bear is swiping at your head ruins everything. Then you throw Wukong's legendary magical abilities into the mix. Being able to literally freeze a massive boss in their tracks with the immobilize spell, get a few heavy hits in, and then seamlessly transform into a giant flaming wolf or a completely different creature mid-combo gives you so much room to experiment. You are constantly managing cooldowns, monitoring your stamina, and reacting to boss AI that actively tries to trick you with delayed swings and aggressive combos. Wukong manages to balance those jaw-dropping next-gen visuals with a combat loop that feels incredibly tight, responsive, and constantly evolving. Every new area you step into introduces another layer of dark mythology, another completely insane boss fight, and another reason why this game is an absolute must-play for anyone who loves deep, challenging action games. When From Software dropped Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, they basically looked at everyone who had spent the last decade mastering the Dark Souls formula and told them to unlearn absolutely everything. You could not just hide behind a massive shield anymore, and if you tried to panic roll your way out of a boss fight with those invincibility frames, you were going to get completely destroyed. Instead, they dropped us into this incredibly atmospheric, blood-soaked vision of Sengoku-era Japan as Wolf, and gave us a combat system that honestly feels way more like a high-speed rhythm game than a traditional action RPG. The entire flow of the gameplay revolves entirely around the posture system. It is all about standing your ground. You are forced to look these massive, terrifying enemies dead in the eye, crossing swords, and listening closely for that exact, specific metallic ringing sound that tells you it is finally your turn to go on the offensive. Because the combat is so heavily reliant on twitch reflexes and split-second deflection windows, your technical setup actually makes a massive difference. When you are playing this on PC, you absolutely need to go in and cap your frame rate with something like RTSS to guarantee perfectly even frame pacing. If you get a micro stutter right in the middle of trying to parry a massive 7-hit combo, you are instantly dead. You need that flawlessly smooth, optimized performance so the game actually responds exactly when your brain tells your hands to move. And honestly, mapping this out on a DualSense controller gives it such an edge. Getting those custom configurations running so you can physically feel the heavy vibration of the blades clashing in your palms just pulls you right into the duel. What makes the whole experience so insanely rewarding is how the game forces you to actually learn the mechanics. There is no grinding for hours to overlevel your character, and you can't just find a ridiculously overpowered weapon to cheese your way through a tough area. It is literally just you, your katana, and the shinobi prosthetic arm. Those prosthetic tools add this brilliant layer of strategy, letting you pull out firecrackers to panic a massive beast, or snapping open a loaded umbrella to tank a heavy sniper shot. Then you factor in the Makiri counter, which might genuinely be one of the most satisfying mechanical interactions ever programmed into a video game. Seeing that bright red, unblockable symbol flash on your screen, realizing a spear is coming right at your chest, and deliberately dodging forward so Wolf literally stomps the weapon directly into the dirt is an unmatched dopamine hit. The entire world design is built around this incredible agility. You are using your grappling hook to launch yourself across the gorgeous, sprawling rooftops of Ashina Castle, finding hidden paths dripping with deep Japanese folklore. It demands a ridiculous amount of patience, and you will get punished repeatedly. But when the rhythm finally clicks in your brain and you stop hesitating, you feel completely unstoppable. Overcoming a boss in Sekiro delivers a pure rush of achievement that almost no other single-player game can even come close to touching. When you bring up Red Dead Redemption 2, you are genuinely talking about the absolute peak of open-world game design. Even now, standing here 7 years after it originally dropped, it completely dwarfs almost every single modern release we get. You boot this up on a proper PC rig today, maybe lock that frame rate down with RTSS so you get a perfectly smooth, stutter-free pan across the heartlands, and the visual fidelity is just staggering. Rockstar built an ecosystem that actually breathes. Stepping into the boots of Arthur Morgan is a massive commitment because the game demands your patience. They deliberately made the pacing of the story incredibly slow, and honestly, that deliberate pacing is exactly why it hits so incredibly hard. The animations have this heavy, grounded weight to them that roots you in the world. You actually have to open individual drawers, physically pick up a can of beans, brush the dirt off your horse, and manually pull back the hammer on your cattleman revolver before you fire off a shot. That level of meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail forces you to actually live in 1899. The world itself does not care if you are there or not. You can walk through the muddy, thick streets of Valentine and bump into an NPC, and they will actually remember that you started a bar fight with them 3 in-game days ago. The ecosystem functions completely independently of the player. Predators hunt smaller prey in the brush, animal carcasses organically decay into bone over time, and the dynamic weather systems, like a massive thunderstorm rolling in over the mountains, drastically change the lighting and the entire mood of your journey. When things inevitably go south and the bullets start flying, the combat feels incredibly raw. The Euphoria physics engine makes every single shot carry massive weight. Enemies stumble, grab their wounds, and react dynamically depending on exactly where you hit them in the heat of a massive shootout. Playing this on a controller is an absolute must to get that true cinematic feel. Getting a DualSense properly hooked up to the PC, feeling the heavy, chunky rumble on the triggers every time you fan the hammer, or feeling the rhythmic vibration of your horse galloping through the deep snow up in Amberino entirely elevates the whole experience. At its core, it is a heartbreaking narrative about loyalty, the desperate fight for survival, and watching the Wild West slowly die out, carried by what might honestly be the greatest protagonist ever written in video game history. You can easily lose hundreds of hours doing absolutely nothing but riding around, listening to the ambient acoustic soundtrack, and watching the dynamic volumetric clouds shift during a sunset. Rockstar built an actual living, breathing world from the ground up, and quite frankly, nothing else has ever managed to touch it. We all know exactly how this story started. The launch of Cyberpunk 2077 is something the gaming community is never going to forget. But what CD Projekt Red managed to pull off over the last few years is absolutely insane. They took a fundamentally flawed release and systematically transformed it into one of the most immersive, staggeringly detailed single-player RPGs ever created. Night City is not just a backdrop, it functions as a living, breathing, terrifyingly dense metropolis that completely swallows you whole. You step into the shoes of V, a mercenary desperately clawing their way through the neon-drenched dystopian gutters of the city, fighting against a literal ticking time bomb in their own head while searching for a way to survive. The sheer density of the world design is almost intimidating when you first step out of your apartment. You have these massive, brutalist mega buildings casting enormous shadows over tight, trash-filled alleyways where dynamic NPCs are just living out their miserable, fascinating lives. And when you finally have this game dialed in on a proper PC setup, it becomes a pure visual masterpiece. You cap your frame rate perfectly with RTSS, get your G-Sync running so there is absolutely zero screen tearing, and just walk through the rain-slicked streets of Japantown at night. The way the dynamic neon lighting reflects off the wet pavement and bounces off the chrome cyberware of random pedestrians creates an atmosphere you genuinely want to get lost in. The gameplay loop has been completely overhauled to match that visual fidelity. The massive 2.0 update and the Phantom Liberty expansion basically rewrote the entire DNA of the combat and progression systems. The character customization is so incredibly deep now, you are no longer just putting points into generic stats, you are actively changing how V physically interacts with the world. You can build a stealthy netrunner who hacks into local networks, uploading quick hacks to fry the optics of an entire squad of Maelstrom gangers without ever stepping foot inside the building. Or you can go the complete opposite route, slot in some heavy gorilla arms, equip a Sandevistan cyberdeck to literally slow down time, and just become an unstoppable chromed-out blur of kinetic violence. The gunplay itself feels phenomenally heavy and impactful. If you take the time to set up a PS5 DualSense controller through DSX on your PC, you can actually feel the mechanical resistance in the triggers when you charge up an electromagnetic tech rifle to shoot straight through a solid concrete wall. You feel the massive metallic kickback of Johnny Silverhand's custom pistol rattling right in your palms. It grounds you in the action so effectively. Every single gig, every random side job, and every branching narrative choice feels like it carries heavy consequences. You are constantly navigating complex relationships with beautifully written, deeply flawed characters. With all the recent updates, the completely revamped vehicle combat, and the incredibly dark, emotional storytelling, Cyberpunk 2077 finally evolved into the absolute powerhouse of an open-world experience that we were always dreaming of playing. When God of War dropped back in 2018, it completely ripped the foundation out from under the franchise and rebuilt it from the absolute ground up, taking Kratos, a character who was historically just a screaming ball of pure rage ripping his way through the Greek pantheon, and dropping him right into the freezing, unforgiving world of Norse mythology was an incredibly massive risk. They aged him up, slowed the pacing down, and gave him a son named Atreus. That specific father-son dynamic completely anchors the entire narrative, bringing this heavy, grounded emotional depth that totally caught everyone off guard. You are genuinely watching a deeply flawed, exhausted god try to figure out how to be a decent dad, and the writing handles that journey flawlessly. Because it is such a deeply story-driven single-player experience, the presentation is incredibly deliberate. That single-shot camera trick they pull off is absolutely mind-blowing. The camera never actually cuts away or fades to black. From the moment you hit New Game to the final credits, you are completely locked into the world with zero loading screens pulling you out of the immersion. And when you finally get into the gritty, heavy combat, it is an absolute masterclass in game feel and animation. The Leviathan axe might genuinely be the most satisfying weapon ever coded into a video game. I usually bounce off games that lean heavily into fighting standard fantasy monsters, but the combat loop here is so incredibly visceral and crunchy that you never actually get tired of cleaving through hordes of Draugr. The whole system revolves around throwing that heavy axe to freeze a target in place, rushing in barehanded to build up an enemy's stun meter with your fists, and then recalling the axe right back to your hand for a massive sweeping finisher. That recall mechanic never ever gets old. If you are playing the PC port, which is wonderfully optimized by the way, getting a PS5 DualSense controller hooked up for something like DSX is absolutely mandatory. Feeling that heavy, sudden thud in the controller's haptic motors the exact millisecond the axe slaps back into Kratos' palm is pure dopamine. You really want to make sure your technical setup is completely dialed in for this one. Going into your settings, capping your frame rate with RTSS, and getting G-Sync perfectly synced up makes the combat flow beautifully without any annoying micro stutters ruining your timing during those massive, screen-shaking boss fights against the Norse gods. The world itself opens up into this sprawling, gorgeous environment packed with rich Norse lore, hidden Valkyrie fights that will completely test your twitch reflexes, and environmental puzzles that give you a nice breather between the heavy action. It is an incredibly polished, highly immersive journey that absolutely nails every single mechanic it introduces. I always say that transitioning a tightly controlled, meticulously paced gameplay loop into a massive open world is usually a massive mistake, but From Software completely pulled it off with Elden Ring. They took the punishing combat formula that defined the entire Dark Souls series and just blew the doors entirely off the hinges. A massive part of why this universe feels so unbelievably dense is because they actually brought in George R.R. Martin to lay down the foundational mythos. He wrote the entire history of the Golden Lineage, the demigods, and the actual political structure of the world long before the game even starts. You can absolutely feel his heavy, dark fantasy fingerprints all over the lore of the lands between. Look, I normally completely bounce off games that lean heavily into standard fantasy monsters and dragons. It usually just feels incredibly generic to me. But the art direction and creature design here are so twisted, tragic, and genuinely grotesque that it completely bypasses that issue. Every single boss you stumble across out in the wild feels like a completely unique, terrifying challenge. The world design heavily encourages you to just pick a random direction and start riding on your spectral steed, Torrent. The sheer volume of ancient secrets, hidden underground cities, and incredibly powerful loot tucked away in the absolute darkest corners of the map is staggering. And honestly, the simple fact that they finally gave us a dedicated jump button fundamentally changes everything about how you approach vertical exploration and combat spacing. Playing this on PC requires a little bit of technical setup to get the absolute premium experience. The game had some pretty notorious frame pacing and micro-stuttering issues around launch, so going into your software, hard capping your frame rate with RTSS, and ensuring your G-Sync is perfectly dialed in is absolutely mandatory. You need that flawless, buttery smooth performance when you are trying to properly time a dodge roll through a massive sweeping boss attack. If you take the time to map a PS5 DualSense controller to your PC rig, it entirely elevates the combat loop. Feeling the heavy, chunky haptic feedback in your palms right as you land a massive jumping heavy attack with a colossal sword is insanely satisfying. The game demands a ridiculous amount of patience, but the freedom to just walk away from a boss that is completely destroying your health bar, explore a completely different area, level up your gear, and come back stronger makes the brutal difficulty feel completely fair. If there is one genre that I will drop absolutely everything to play, it is a heavily story-driven, deeply immersive single-player game that actually respects your time. A Plague Tale: Innocence perfectly nails exactly that. We talk a lot about massive open worlds, but sometimes you just need a laser-focused, incredibly grounded narrative. Asobo Studio dropped us straight into 14th century medieval France right during the absolute peak of the Black Death, and the atmosphere they built is staggeringly heavy. If you appreciate the hyper-realistic, muddy, gritty historical vibes of something like Kingdom Come: Deliverance, the world design here is going to completely blow your mind. You can practically smell the damp wood and the decay just looking at the environments. You play as Amicia, who is suddenly thrust into this horrifying survival situation, dragging her little brother Hugo through the countryside while actively being hunted by the French Inquisition. Escort missions usually make me want to pull my hair out, but the character AI and the underlying emotional writing here actually make you fiercely protective of this kid. The subtle animations of Amicia reaching back to grab Hugo's hand as you are sneaking through the tall grass really root you in their relationship. It forces you to play carefully, completely grounded in the reality of the situation. The gameplay loop is a brilliant mix of tense stealth and environmental puzzle solving, entirely because you are incredibly vulnerable. You are not some heavily armored knight, you are literally just a teenager with a rock sling. But man, the audio design on that sling is incredible. Getting a perfect, completely silent headshot on an unhelmeted guard gives you this sickening, visceral crack that makes the combat feel completely raw and desperate. Running this on a PC with a PS5 DualSense controller mapped through DSX completely elevates that tension. Feeling the physical, mechanical resistance in the triggers as you wind up the leather strap of the sling, or the subtle haptic rumbles of footsteps in the thick mud, makes the immersion so much deeper. And then, obviously, you have the rats. I normally despise generic fantasy monsters in video games, but the rats here function completely differently. They act more like a terrifying, dynamic fluid simulation. They are a massive environmental hazard that you have to actively manipulate using the game's gorgeous dynamic lighting engine. You're constantly scrambling to find sticks to light on fire or shooting alchemical fire down corridors, calculating exactly how long your light source will last before it burns out and the shadows literally swallow you whole. The custom engine Asobo built for this is absolutely stunning, rendering thousands of independent rat models on screen at the exact same time without breaking a sweat. To really appreciate how hauntingly beautiful the art direction is, you definitely want to go into your software, lock down your frame rate with RTSS, and make sure your G-Sync is completely dialed in. You absolutely need that flawless, stutter-free frame pacing when the camera is panning across these massive, decaying French villages, or when you are sprinting away from a literal tidal wave of plague rats. It might not have the 100-hour sprawling map of a massive open-world RPG, but it absolutely does not need to. What it delivers is a tightly paced, brutally dark, and unforgettable narrative experience that easily hits a perfect 10 out of 10. When Rocksteady released Batman Arkham Asylum, they essentially created the perfect enclosed Metroidvania-style superhero game. We all thought they had peaked, but then they dropped Arkham City and proved absolutely everybody wrong by taking that flawless foundation and expanding it into this massive, terrifyingly dense open-world prison. They walled off a huge chunk of Gotham's slums, threw all the worst criminals inside, and just let you loose. The atmosphere they built is completely suffocating. You are grappling up to these crumbling gothic gargoyles, watching the dynamic snow realistically accumulate on Batman's cape, and listening to the ambient radio chatter of street thugs who are genuinely terrified that you are out there in the dark watching them. And you really do feel like the absolute apex predator. The transition from the tight, claustrophobic corridors of the asylum to gliding across the massive skyline of Arkham City fundamentally changed how we navigated open worlds. The dive bomb mechanic alone, where you build up ridiculous momentum dropping toward the street and pull up at the last possible second to launch yourself across the map, feels incredibly kinetic and completely seamless. But where the game truly cements itself as an all-time great is the free-flow combat system. It is basically a rhythm game heavily disguised as a brawler. The animations are so meticulously polished that Batman snaps from one thug to the next with this brutal, bone-breaking weight. Every single counterattack feels distinctly heavy and responsive. If you were going back to record or replay this today, you realize how incredibly well the optimization holds up. Because it is a slightly older release, you can easily load this up on a fun secondary capture rig, something running an older i7-3770 paired with an RX 6400, and it will run flawlessly without breaking a sweat. But to get that premium, modern, tactical feel, going out of your way to hook up a PS5 DualSense controller to your PC using a wrapper like X360EC or DSX is an absolute game changer. Getting that heavy physical rumble in the controller right as you slam a thug through a weak wooden floorboard makes the combat loop infinitely more satisfying. And of course, jumping into your software to lock your frame rate down with RTSS to get a perfectly smooth, stutter-free panning camera while you are surrounded by 20 armed guards is essential for maintaining those massive combo multipliers. The Predator stealth sections are a complete masterclass in AI design and environmental pacing. You are actively engaging in psychological warfare. You string one guy up from a vantage point, and the remaining enemies actually start to panic. You can literally switch to detective vision and watch their heart rates physically spike. They start shooting blindly into the shadows, and they completely change their patrol routes to cover each other's backs. The game constantly forces you to adapt your strategy, especially when it comes to the major encounters. The Mr. Freeze boss battle is still widely considered one of the most brilliant encounters ever designed because the AI actively learns your moves. If you use a silent takedown from a floor grate, he literally freezes the grates shut. If you try to use the explosive gel twice, he scrambles the signal. You are forced to utilize every single gadget in your utility belt and actually think like Batman to survive. The writing perfectly balances this massive roster of iconic, deeply flawed villains like Two-Face, Ra's al Ghul, and an incredibly desperate, dying Joker without the narrative ever feeling bloated or unfocused. Every single encounter adds a rich, meaningful layer to the overarching story. Arkham City itself functions as the primary antagonist, a decaying, hyper-detailed playground that forces you to completely master your environment and truly become the Bat. When you talk about games that genuinely alter your brain chemistry, NieR Automata absolutely has to be at the top of the conversation. Yoko Taro is a creative madman, and teaming his deeply philosophical writing up with the incredibly tight combat designers over at Platinum Games was a stroke of pure genius. You are dropped straight into this overwhelmingly bleak, desolate version of Earth thousands of years in the future, playing as these beautifully designed combat androids, 2B and 9S. The basic premise sounds simple enough on paper. Humanity supposedly fled to the moon after a massive alien invasion, and you are sent down to the surface to wipe out the remaining rusted, clunky machine life forms. But what actually unfolds is this devastating, highly emotional spiral into existential dread, questioning purpose and figuring out what it genuinely means to have a soul. As a deeply story-driven, single-player experience, the narrative structure is completely insane and refuses to play by normal rules. The first time you see the credits roll, you have literally only finished the prologue of the actual story. The game demands that you play through multiple, entirely different routes to actually uncover the true ending. Each new playthrough completely shifts your perspective, unlocking entirely new hacking mechanics, switching up the protagonists, and dropping absolutely gut-wrenching context that completely recontextualizes everything you did in the previous 10 hours. The moment-to-moment gameplay is incredibly kinetic and fluid. Because Platinum Games built the engine, the combat has this insanely high skill ceiling while remaining completely accessible. You are flawlessly chaining together light and heavy attacks with these massive floating weapons while simultaneously using your little floating pod companion to lay down constant suppressive fire. But the most mind-blowing mechanical hook is how the game completely refuses to stick to one single genre. You will be right in the middle of a massive, fully 3D character action boss fight, and the camera will seamlessly pan straight up to the ceiling, instantly turning the entire game into a hardcore top-down bullet hell shooter. Then you run down a pipe, the camera snaps hard to the side, and suddenly you are playing a 2.5D side-scrolling platformer. The transitions are flawlessly smooth and keep you constantly adapting your muscle memory. Obviously, if you are playing this on PC, it historically required a little bit of technical love to get it running perfectly. The original port was famously a bit rough, but once you get those standard community fixes installed and jump into your software to cap your frame rate perfectly with RTSS, the experience completely transforms. Ensuring you have absolutely zero micro-stuttering and getting your G-Sync completely dialed in makes the combat flow feel absolutely unmatched. And for a game that relies so heavily on split-second dodging, getting a PS5 DualSense controller properly hooked up to your rig through DSX is basically mandatory. Feeling the distinct, heavy haptic vibration every time you execute a perfect dodge, watching 2B turn into a glowing blur of afterimages before delivering a massive, screen-shaking counterattack makes you feel completely untouchable. You also absolutely cannot talk about this masterpiece without heavily praising the soundtrack. Keiichi Okabe created a dynamic audio experience that is genuinely staggering. The haunting, melancholic vocals actually fade in and out dynamically depending on whether you are just quietly exploring the rusted-out city ruins or actively engaged in a frantic hacking minigame. The music is practically its own character. NieR Automata completely swallows you whole. It is a profoundly emotional, incredibly polished journey that actively plays with the medium of video games in ways that nobody else even attempts, and it absolutely refuses to leave your head long after you put the controller down. When Naughty Dog pivoted from the pulpy, high-octane action of the Uncharted series to create The Last of Us, nobody was really prepared for how heavily the industry was about to shift. This completely abandoned the arcadey feeling of generic zombie survival games. What they delivered is a painstakingly grounded, brutally realistic dive into pure human desperation, and it entirely rewrote the rulebook on how narrative design works in this medium. You take control of Joel, a smuggler who has been completely hollowed out by 20 years of surviving a collapsed, overgrown version of America, and you are suddenly forced to escort a deeply cynical, immune teenager named Ellie across the country. The slow, methodical way their relationship organically develops through the actual moment-to-moment gameplay, rather than relying solely on cutscenes, is an absolute masterclass in writing. You are watching these two deeply flawed, traumatized characters slowly learn to trust each other, and the emotional weight of that journey hits incredibly hard. But the gameplay loop is where the tension truly sinks its teeth into you. Every single combat encounter feels raw, heavy, and completely desperate. You are never fully equipped to handle a situation. You are constantly forced into this terrifying survival stealth rhythm, scavenging through gorgeous, decaying, meticulously detailed environments, just hoping to find a half-empty bottle of alcohol and a dirty rag so you can tape together a single medkit. The animations carry this unbelievable weight to them. When Joel swings a splintered 2x4 or slams an infected against a brick wall, you feel the physical exhaustion and the heavy momentum in his movements. It is incredibly visceral. If you are running the Part 1 remake on PC today, getting your technical setup perfectly optimized completely elevates the tension of these encounters. You absolutely want to jump into your background software and hard cap your frame rate with RTSS. Getting that flawless, stutter-free frame pacing with G-Sync fully dialed in is crucial, because when a blind clicker suddenly spots you and that terrifying clicking audio cue hits, a random micro-stutter will literally get your jugular ripped out. And honestly, taking the time to map a PS5 DualSense controller to your rig is an absolute must for this game. Feeling the heavy mechanical resistance and the adaptive triggers when you slowly draw back a bowstring, or feeling the subtle haptic rumble of the rain while you are sneaking through the flooded, ruined streets of Boston, creates a level of immersion that a standard mouse and keyboard simply cannot replicate. The enemy AI genuinely forces you to play smart, too. The human hunters will actively flank you, call out your specific hiding spots to their friends, and dynamically push your position the second they hear your revolver click empty. You are constantly balancing incredibly tense, slow-paced stealth with sudden, chaotic bursts of panic. Wrapped up in Gustavo Santaolala's incredibly haunting, stripped-down acoustic guitar soundtrack, the entire world feels profoundly isolating, terrifying, and yet somehow completely beautiful. It is a deeply emotional, purely single-player masterpiece that entirely breaks your heart by the time the final credits roll, and it absolutely refuses to leave your head. When it comes to actually wrapping up a massive franchise, studios almost always fumble the bag at the finish line, but Naughty Dog delivered an absolute masterclass with Uncharted 4: A Thief's Hand. Sending off Nathan Drake after a decade of crazy, globe-trotting adventures was a massive task, and the way they handled it was completely brilliant. They actually grounded him. You start the game watching Nate work a normal salvage job, desperately trying to live a quiet, retired life with Elena, and you physically feel that heavy domestic stagnation. The emotional maturity in the writing is completely off the charts for what is essentially a blockbuster action game. You genuinely feel the weight of Nate's obsession with history and danger actively tearing at his personal relationships the second his supposedly dead brother Sam shows up to pull him back in. But obviously, because it is a modern Naughty Dog title, the gameplay loop has to completely blow your mind. The character animations are so ridiculously fluid that it almost looks pre-rendered. The way Nate realistically stumbles when he lands a jump or physically reaches out to brace himself against a wall when you run too close to it builds this massive level of physical immersion. And they fundamentally broke open the traditional cover shooter combat by finally giving you a grappling hook. You are no longer just awkwardly sitting behind a waist-high piece of concrete waiting for your health to regenerate. You are actively swinging across massive chasms, dropping down on shoreline mercenaries from above, and sliding down steep mud slopes while firing a weapon completely one-handed. Speaking of the mud, the physics and environmental details in the Madagascar open area section are completely insane. You actually feel the tires of your Jeep physically fighting for grip, and the red dirt dynamically cakes onto the chassis in real time. If you are playing the Legacy of Thieves collection on a proper PC setup today, it is a staggering visual experience. You absolutely want to jump into your background software and hard cap your frame rate with RTSS. Getting that flawless, stutter-free frame pacing with G-Sync fully dialed in is completely essential, especially when you hit that massive armored truck chase sequence through the city. That specific set piece might honestly be the greatest action sequence ever rendered in real time. The camera seamlessly pulling you from a cinematic cutscene straight into high-octane gameplay without a single loading screen pulling you out of the immersion is incredible. Because it is such a deeply cinematic, deeply story-driven single-player experience, playing this with a standard mouse and keyboard almost feels wrong. You really need to take the time to map a PS5 DualSense controller to your PC rig. Feeling the heavy mechanical resistance in the adaptive triggers when you're firing the different weapons, or feeling the subtle haptic rumble of the winch cable pulling massive physical tension completely roots you right in the action. It grounds the entire experience. They took an absolutely beloved character, gave him the most ridiculously polished, visually stunning playground ever built, and delivered an incredibly emotional farewell that perfectly wraps up his story. When CD Projekt Red dropped The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt back in 2015, they completely broke the mold for what an open-world RPG was actually supposed to be. Before this, we were so used to massive maps filled with absolute garbage, meaningless fetch quests, completely lifeless NPCs, and a million pointless icons just cluttering up the screen. But stepping into the boots of Geralt of Rivia entirely changed the standard. They built a staggering, dark fantasy universe where every single square inch actually matters. You start off riding Roach through the horrifyingly depressing muddy swamps of Velen. The trees are physically bending in the wind, which, by the way, has some of the absolute best ambient audio design ever recorded, and you see the brutal aftermath of a massive war. People are starving, hanging from trees, and just trying to survive in a deeply grounded, gritty reality. And then you seamlessly ride straight into the massive, sprawling cobblestone streets of the free city of Novigrad, where the political intrigue and the criminal underworld take over completely. But what actually cements this game as an all-time masterpiece is the writing, specifically when it comes to the side quests. You might randomly walk up to a tiny, obscure village notice board and grab a standard monster contract, expecting a quick 5-minute fight. Instead, you get pulled into this deeply emotional 10-hour branching narrative about a cursed werewolf, or you end up playing detective to solve a horrific serial murders in the city. The Bloody Baron questline alone is widely considered one of the greatest pieces of storytelling in modern gaming, because the moral ambiguity is so incredibly thick. There are absolutely no clear good or bad choices. There are only heavy, tragic consequences that permanently alter the state of the world. The combat requires you to actually think and prepare like a professional monster hunter. You cannot just run in swinging blindly. You have to open up the bestiary, figure out exactly what kind of oil is going to properly coat your silver sword, brew the right alchemical potions, and know exactly which magical sign is going to stagger your target. If you are running the recent next-gen update on a proper PC setup, it is visually breathtaking. You really want to make sure your technical side is completely dialed in for this one. Jumping into your background software to hard cap your frame rate with RTSS and ensuring your G-Sync is completely locked is going to make riding through those thick Novigrad crowds completely stutter-free. And honestly, taking the time to map a PS5 DualSense controller to your PC using something like DSX entirely elevates the immersion. Feeling that subtle haptic rumble in the triggers every single time you cast the Igni sign to blast a group of drowners, or feeling the heavy metallic clash of your sword against a griffin's beak anchors you straight into the mud and the blood of the fights. They took this massively complex, politically heavy universe, filled it with profoundly well-written, deeply flawed human characters, and gave us an experience that still dictates exactly how developers design open worlds today. It is quite literally the gold standard for how to write a massive, single-player adventure. When Lorien Studios finally dropped Baldur's Gate 3, it felt like a massive, once-in-a-generation shift for the entire RPG genre. They somehow managed to take the incredibly dense, often intimidating rules of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and translated them into a digital experience that feels completely intuitive, reactive, and staggeringly deep. You aren't just playing through a pre-written story, you are effectively co-authoring a massive, sprawling epic in the Forgotten Realms, where every single tiny choice you make, from how you talk to a random squirrel in the woods to how you handle a major political assassination, ripples out and fundamentally changes the world around you. The level of freedom is actually kind of overwhelming in the best way. If you want to spend 20 minutes stacking crates to climb over a fortress wall instead of fighting your way through the front gate, the game just lets you do it. The environmental verticality and the sheer number of systemic interactions are insane. You can grease a floor, light it on fire with a cantrip, and then shove an enemy into the blaze, all in one turn. It rewards that what if I tried this curiosity that makes tabletop gaming so special, and the production value is just on another level. Every single line of dialogue, even for the most obscure side characters, is fully motion captured and voiced with an incredible amount of personality and nuance. You genuinely start to care about your companions, their trauma, and their messy backstories because they feel like real, complicated people sitting right there in front of you. Because this is such a dense, visually rich game with massive, crowded environments like the city of Baldur's Gate itself, you definitely want to make sure your technical setup is perfectly optimized to handle the engine. To get that truly cinematic, butter-smooth experience you're looking for, you absolutely have to jump into your software and hard cap your frame rate with RTSS. Getting your G-Sync dialed in is essential for keeping the frame pacing consistent, especially when the screen gets cluttered with complex spell effects and dozens of AI entities all taking their turns at once. And even though it's a CRPG, playing this with a DualSense controller on PC feels surprisingly fantastic. Lorian built a completely custom radial menu UI specifically for controllers that makes navigating your massive spellbook feel tactile and responsive. Feeling that heavy haptic feedback in your palms when you land a critical hit, or the subtle tension in the triggers during a high-stakes dialogue roll, just adds that extra layer of physical immersion. It's an absolute powerhouse of a game that respects your intelligence and your creativity, offering a level of narrative depth and mechanical polish that we honestly haven't seen in decades. It's not just an RPG, it's a masterpiece of player agency. When you think about the absolute peak of the grand strategy genre on PC, you have to talk about Total War Warhammer. This was such a massive, ambitious pivot for Creative Assembly. They took that rock-solid, historical Total War foundation and just slammed it right into the visceral, dark fantasy universe of Warhammer. The result is something that feels way more epic and addictive than any historical title ever could. You aren't just moving blocks of spearmen around a field anymore. You are commanding literal legions of the undead, massive, scaly lizard men riding dinosaurs, and towering, terrifying chaos monsters that can single-handedly break a front line. The sheer scale of the real-time battles is staggering. Seeing thousands of individual units clashing on a massive, hyper-detailed battlefield is a total wow moment every single time. But it is the mechanical depth that really keeps you hooked for hundreds of hours. Every single race plays completely differently. If you're playing as the Skaven, you're dealing with undercities and overwhelming numbers, whereas the dwarves are all about slow, tanky front lines and devastating gunpowder artillery. It forces you to completely change your tactical brain depending on who you're facing. You have to account for flying units dropping stones from the sky, powerful legendary lords like Karl Franz or Grimgor Ironhide, who can turn the tide of a battle with a single magical ability, and the sheer terror factor of monsters that can cause your entire army to rout if you aren't careful. Now, because these battles can get incredibly chaotic with thousands of models and complex particle effects from magic spells, your PC setup is absolutely critical. To get that ultra-smooth cinematic feel while the camera is sweeping over a massive siege, you really need to go into your software and hard cap your frame rate with RTSS. Getting that G-Sync perfectly dialed in is the only way to ensure you don't get those annoying micro stutters when the AI starts pathfinding 2,000 units through a narrow city gate. You want that buttery smooth performance so you can actually appreciate the insane level of detail on the unit models and the fluid animations as a giant literally picks up a soldier and bites his head off. The campaign map is just as deep, blending high-stakes diplomacy and empire management with a world-shaping narrative. You're constantly making these massive, world-altering choices: who to ally with, which ancient city to raze to the ground, and how to manage the encroaching threat of chaos. It's a perfect blend of grand strategy and deep, gritty lore that makes every single campaign feel like a unique story. It is easily one of the greatest RTS masterpieces ever put on the platform, and if you have any love for fantasy or strategy, it's basically an essential install. If you're looking for a game that will genuinely make you question your own sanity and every political belief you've ever held, you have to talk about Disco Elysium. This isn't just some standard isometric RPG where you click on bad guys until they drop loot. It is a dense, hallucinogenic, and deeply philosophical detective noir that completely throws out traditional combat in favor of something way more interesting: the internal monologue of a total wreck. You play as an amnesiac detective in the decaying, beautiful coastal district of Martinez, and your goal is theoretically to solve a murder, but you're mostly just trying to piece together the shattered remains of your own mind. The mechanical heart of this game is the skill system, and honestly, it is one of the most brilliant things ever put into a game. You have 24 different skills, but they aren't just stats, they are distinct voices in your head that constantly argue with you. Your Inland Empire skill might start rambling about the cosmic significance of a discarded shoe, while your logic tries to keep you grounded, and Half-Light is just screaming at you to punch someone because it senses a vague threat. The way these skills intervene in dialogue through invisible dice rolls is incredibly addictive. You're not just playing a character, you're managing a committee of conflicting impulses. One failed check can lead to you having a heart attack because you tried to sit in an uncomfortable chair, or accidentally starting a physical confrontation because your physical instrument got too hyped up. Because it's so dialogue heavy, the pacing is entirely up to you. You can spend hours just talking to a giant racist truck driver or debating the merits of ultra-liberalism with a wealthy person on a boat. The writing is incredibly sharp, cynical, and surprisingly heartbreaking. It captures this specific vibe of failed revolution and personal ruin that feels so grounded and real despite the world being fictional. To really soak in that haunting, melancholic atmosphere, especially that incredible soundtrack by British Sea Power, you want the technical side to be invisible. Even though it isn't a high-action shooter, I still recommend jumping into your software and capping your frame rate with RTSS. Getting that perfectly smooth, stutter-free scroll as you walk through the oil-painted streets of Revachol makes the art style look absolutely breathtaking. And if you're playing on PC, mapping it to a DualSense controller actually feels surprisingly cozy. You can just lean back, feel the subtle haptic feedback when the world reacts to your thoughts, and get completely lost in the narrative. And honestly, that brings us to the end of the list. We just covered 15 absolute heavyweights, games that don't just entertain you for a weekend, but actually set a new standard for what this medium can achieve. Whether it's the visceral, bone-crushing combat of God of War, the obsessive attention to detail in Red Dead 2, or the psychological depth of Disco Elysium, every single one of these titles has earned that perfect 10 out of 10. They are the games that remind us why we love this hobby. Thanks so much for hanging out and nerding out over these with me. I'll see you in the next one.